Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar on NetApp Keystone's pay-as-you-consume product. We apologize for the delay in getting started. We are having a few technical difficulties. If you would hold tight, we will be started in just about 1 minute.
I'm ready. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can. Go ahead, Kent.
All right. Sorry about that. There was a calendar mix-up. But for those who hung in there, hopefully this will be worth your time. Appreciate your time. We wanted to talk a little bit about the consumption models that are kind of taking the industry by storm, and specifically Keystone. And we welcome your questions at any time here. You can use the chat to send a question to us, and we'll take the time to answer it now or afterwards. So excited to talk about it. It is, as I mentioned, something that's getting pretty exciting, and the NetApp solution is an awesome solution to consider. So just a very, very brief, who's Insight? You know, Insight is a company that if you knew it a few years ago, you may not recognize it today. A few years ago, it was primarily focused on the left side, which is supply chain, getting technology to you, including software and enterprise agreements, et cetera, in the most efficient way possible at the lowest cost. Then they started acquiring companies, including companies in digital innovation, where that group is doing things like AI and IoT, and that's over 1,000 people. They acquired companies where many of us came from, like Datalink, that forms cloud and data center transformation. That's now a $2+ to $2.5 to $3 billion business, and growing very rapidly. And that's kind of the center of where we'll have the conversation. And then there's an area for endpoint called connected workforce. And so all together, we work all together to get the right solution to the right client at the right time. So this is, we've probably been talking about Keystone for a year, and that's because we were very early with it. NetApp actually announced their GA of the product last November, and we had already been working with them on it for a year. But that's nothing new. When they came up with this concept of working with Cisco on a FlexPod, we did that. We figured out how to put the services around it and became the first FlexPod premium partner and the first FlexPod support partner. But as we go through their evolution into Flash, leading Flash provider, as they got into their early on-demand models, which the market wasn't ready for, as they got into cloud, which we'll start to talk for, you'll see many of the times we're there first, and Keystone's no different. From the Insight point of view, Keystone is obviously focused on data management, storage, if you would. But the way we use the term data management is it's data management, whether it's on premises or in a hybrid solution or in the cloud. A lot of things go with that, and we take that broader view at Insight. We understand that it requires a network and maybe some compute, and probably security, and maybe there's cloud in there, and somehow you want to back it up and protect it against ransomware. And so we are taking a holistic view, and you'll see how Keystone fits into that as we move forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the market. You do not need to read all the pictures in the slide or all the words in the slide. I think the way it is best summed up is about a year ago, before any of the things that we now know as the most significant events of 2020 from a pandemic point of view, the analysts, for example, Gartner said, this market prior to this has been less than 1% of people buying infrastructure were actually wanted to consume it as a service or a cloud-like consumption. As we fast forward into 2020 and we got going and we realized a lot has changed, they probably came out and said that number might be more like double that. So you're talking, while we're in IDC is in the 40 to 50% range, that all infrastructure acquired in data centers will not be a CapEx purchase, but will be looking for something like a consumption model or pay for what you use. So there's two messages there. One, it's very relevant, and most of your organizations should be looking at it. And two, it doesn't necessarily mean it's for everything. It's just like cloud, less than a third of all workloads are in the cloud. It's not for everything, but we certainly want to see if it fits your organizational model, because it is rapidly growing in the attractiveness. So let's talk about what it is. Whether you're a public entity or a private company, you probably know the basic, what we call CapEx. This is how I buy technology. You know, I kind of design what I need, hopefully with help. I figure out what I need over some period of time. I pay for it up front in a CapEx model. Hopefully my budget this year fits paying for it today. And ultimately, I am responsible for that. The customer, the client is responsible for, you know, if I bought too much, that's not good. If I bought too little, that's not good. I need to take care of it. I need to care for it, et cetera. So it's a CapEx asset that sits on the books. Leases got popular, you know, in the 2010 or so, you know, range where, hey, what if I didn't want to pay today? But FASB came along about 3 or 4 years ago and said, well, it's still going to impact your budget and your books in the same way. And so a lot of people say, look, even though you're paying for it over time, it has to hit your budget and your books and things like that in the time that you write that, because you essentially own it for the term of a contract. Now, on the other end, we mentioned a little bit that NetApp's been in the cloud business for a while. And if you wanted to buy a NetApp data management solution in the cloud, you'd see that cloud has, you know, I don't have to plan up front. I don't have to know the end game over a long period of time. I can, you know, pay for what I need as I use it. I've got a lot of flexibility to grow and shrink. And, you know, it's got a lot of capacity in the upside, but I also have the flexibility to go down, et cetera. So those are some of the agility and flexibility at cloud is a major reason why a lot of people are saying this is really a good fit for my business model. So as a service fits in between those. You know, it is going to sit in the data center. There will be a piece of hardware, but the consumption model looks a lot like cloud, where you pay X amount per month based on what you use, and you have a lot of flexibility to go up or down. And all of these, depending on your particular circumstances, if you know exactly what I need for 5 years, then CapEx might be a little less expensive. If you're growing or moving or having any shifting in your business model, then as a service might make sense. In cloud, as we'll kind of illustrate for storage, you kind of have to be careful. If you're spinning things up and down and doing an analytics run, clearly the lowest cost, because I didn't have to set anything up to do it. I could just kind of get it going right away and then shut it down. But if you run it too long, we've seen cloud storage costs, and we'll give you a specific example, but you know, they can be 2 to 3 times as much as, for example, CapEx. So you kind of want to understand what's my use case, and then, you know, how does that fit into these different options I have. The key here, you now have another option. You don't have to go cloud or CapEx. You now have the as a service model. So when do I want to do this? So now we spend a lot of time with clients, and actually a little bit surprising that the first thing that happened wasn't, you know, in the middle of 2020, wasn't, oh my gosh, I need to save capital. What's the easiest way to do that? And you can look at the consumption model on the left saying, hey, you don't have to pay up front. I give you flexibility, scale up and down. It's not a CapEx purchase. It ended up that most of the clients that we were looking at, public and private, were more interested in the strategic alignment. So some organizations said, I've got a cloud strategy. In that cloud strategy, there's uncertainty, especially with data, of what's going to be in the cloud and when. And so this is a perfect bridge to cloud, where I can be putting things on Keystone and moving over to the cloud when and if that makes sense. So we've seen a lot of that. And the other way is, you know, and that took out risk, but the other way is just to reduce risk from business uncertainty. We're going to give an example of a public institution. This happened to be federal, that said, you know what, I got a lot of money coming in this year. They call it COVID money. But I don't know what the budget is next year. And I really want to do a refresh, but, you know, that doesn't make sense if things change, et cetera. And so they looked at the different solution and said, well, this actually takes risk out of my decision of what I need to do over the next X number of years, because I have that flexibility. So therefore, that makes it an easier decision. So all of these really do one thing. You know, it takes risk. A CapEx purchase has risk in that you need to know what you need for a predefined period of time. And there is some flexibility to that. But when you can pay for what you use, and align it to a cloud strategy or align it to a changing business model, that takes a lot of risk out of this decision. So that's an option that we're seeing a significant amount of our clients consider when they're trying to look at a large purchase like that. Now, the market has evolved in 2020, and pretty much as you go to websites or listen to people from OEMs and vendors, et cetera, come in, almost everybody's going to lead with an as-a-service offering. The message is getting out. And so there's really two ways to look at that. And we partner with almost everybody because I think when you start to realize how Insight delivers as a service, and if you put yourselves in the shoes of an OEM, whether that be NetApp or Cisco or HPE or a Dell, and you say, well, which partners can actually deliver my service? There's not that many that have built the services around that. So because we see all of them, and because all of them are calling us and either partners with us or looking to be partners with us, we have a broad view of what's going on in the market. So we absolutely can have that discussion with any of you that says, here's what's going on with everybody. But one of the things we do is we break it into two large buckets. One of them, and Keystone fits into this, is it's service-based pricing, which means that I can tell you the price before I start sizing you up, before I know the size of your environment, before I know, what you're doing. Now, that's probably different than the last time you bought storage, where they sized everything up and then came back with a price. In this case, there's a price, and then you decide how you want to consume it. The config-based pricing, and we named a couple of the big OEMs like HPE and Dell, tend to do it the other way around. I'm going to configure a bunch of stuff for you, and then based on the as a service, I can come up with a price. And so that's a massive difference. And there are some companies on the left, we expect Cisco to be there, NetApp, et cetera, and there are many companies on the right where it's easier, think about it, it's safer to them to size the deal before pricing it, where a service-based price, and, when you think about it, NetApp has been doing this for a while. For example, if I go out and Google Cloud Volumes in AWS, there's a price. If I will go Google Azure NetApp Files on Azure, there's a price. You didn't size it beforehand. That's service-based pricing, and so that's what they did with Keystone. So the other real differentiator between NetApp and other data management companies is they, again, a few years ago said, hey, I get this cloud thing. It's relevant. It's not everything, but it's absolutely relevant, and therefore I'm going to make sure my data management runs in the cloud. So, 5 years ago, we were bringing clients onto Cloud ONTAP, which is really the ability to say, I've got NetApp in my data center, but I want to put a copy in the cloud for DR or backup or whatever, make an easy way to communicate. But then they took and put the native service, like Keystone services, and they put services in the cloud, and it's called Cloud Volumes on Google and AWS, and it's called Azure NetApp Files on Azure. And these things are similar, and we're going to show you specifically how similar. But really, you're saying that now I've got the ability to run a workload in the cloud, next to the cloud, in like an Equinix data center or in my data center on kind of a common platform. And that's what NetApp refers to the data fabric. And that's a very powerful story that, we don't see anybody else in the industry. They're going to talk cloud. They're going to talk these things. But this is a pretty clear illustration that NetApp is actually doing that. So that brings us to NetApp Keystone. And you'll see that, now before, everything I was talking about really had nothing to do with NetApp, except for the data fabric. It had primarily to do with what's happening in the industry. So what is NetApp doing with Keystone? We showed you on the previous slide that they have native services running in the cloud. They had a CapEx model in the data center, and somebody said, well, we should make it so that they can consume in the data center like they consume in the cloud. And so that's really what Keystone is doing. Could have been called Cloud Volumes on-prem, but it's called Keystone, and it's really how can I buy cloud-like products in my data center. Yes, you will get a piece of hardware in your data center, but like the cloud, you won't own it, you won't be responsible for it, you won't have to run it. It's there to deliver a service, and it's not there for you to own and take care of. So that's what Keystone is in a nutshell. Alignment to cloud, again, don't have to read all this, but if you really look at Keystone and you say, hey, fundamentally, it's got service levels, standard, premium, extreme. And, engineer teams can sit there and say, okay, premium will have this many, this and that, and it'll fit these workloads. And that's the designing of a service. But the service comes down to standard, premium, extreme. Then you can do this today, right now, if you want to. You could just go out and Google cloud volumes, pricing, and you'll see service levels, standard, premium, extreme. You could go and say Azure NetApp files, pricing, and you'll see standard, premium, they call it ultra there, but extreme, and you'll see the prices on each. And if you start looking at this, you realize that these are pretty much the same levels of service in both, right? So now I can run on Keystone in my data center, or I can run in Google, AWS, or Azure, and I can run the same level of a service in either place. Now, one of the things you'll notice, and kind of make the point we made earlier, is that a service in the cloud typically can cost more than a service on-prem. And when you see the pricing, if you Google it right now and say, what's the pricing in the cloud, and then you see in a minute what the rate is for Keystone, and you start doing some math, you realize that most of these are at least 2 times what these are. And that's not because NetApp did any pricing wrong, it's just, data in cloud is significantly more expensive, and there's no better example than one company saying, my premium service on the data center, on your data center in a service is $1, but it's $2 in the cloud. So that's as clear as it can be, and they're competitive in both spaces. But that is an example of both the data fabric going across multiple platforms and just an illustration of what it's like to move data to the cloud. So this is the highest level rate card. And I think you can get a copy of this so nobody has to take notes or anything. But what you see is 2 things. One, that standard, premium, extreme, which if you know NetApp, you'll know, well, this is their ONTAP line, which can do file and block and SIPs and NFS and all of these capabilities that NetApp's always been able to do. So this is kind of their FAS ONTAP line. You can probably guess that a premium or extreme is going to be an all flash and a standard is going to be a hybrid. But you'll also notice that they have object, and somebody knowing NetApp would say, well, that looks like storage grid. And they have block, which looks like E-series, and they're all available in services. I'd ask you to take one more look at one thing. I think we got fortunate, maybe you could call it lazy, it was luxurious, that to take risk out of designing storage because flash had become very aggressive in a price. We just started saying, for a lot of clients, just put it all in flash. I don't want to deal with what should go where. But when you start looking at the service, you see the price is 3x between a hybrid service and a flash service. So keep that in mind as we size an environment, because some people will start with, give me 300 premium, and then we say, are you sure you need 300 premium? And then we'll help them and figure out, well, I needed 150 premium and 150 standard, and as you can imagine, that changes things quite a bit. This is the next iteration. So, before they even went GA, they realized that a lot of clients are using this data tiering concept. So NetApp has been awesome at doing this all along. And you can essentially say, look, I'm going to land data on my on-prem storage, whether it be a premium or extreme level storage, but it's going to be on some sort of high performance storage. And I might want to tier it out to cloud, or I might want to tier it onto object. Cloud would be out to the public cloud, but object could be sitting in your data center. And so premium with data tiering and extreme with data tiering, is that all just bundled together? That says, what if, about 25% of my storage was on the high performance, and then 75% was in a more long-term retention media like object, especially in public sector. We just did one that was, a government agency but it's many petabytes, and that's how they wanted to use their data. But we are seeing this more and more. They're like looking at all the different service levels, and they're saying, look, that is actually how I do this. I was doing this by hand having storage on the high performance, and then as it got older, I was retaining it and things like that. So we're actually seeing a bunch of public sectors come in and say, hey, it ends up that when I start designing it, this is actually a good fit. So just another option when you're considering configuring. So we talked a little earlier about, you may have, 100, 300, 500, a petabyte, 2 petabytes, 5 petabytes, 10, whatever it is, and you probably have a good idea of what you have today based on what you've done in the past. And a lot of times that's good enough to get started. But then, once we start sharpening the pencil, a lot of organizations will say, well, wait a minute, what if I wanted to get, kind of a more exact view of what I'm doing today, and then I can give my input of where I think that's going. And so we have a number of ways to do that. One is called the Service Design Workshop. That was actually a NetApp tool that they always had. What we did was we slimmed it down to say, hey, within a week, we can collect information and give you a graph that shows these are your workloads and these are how they fit into those service levels: standard, premium, extreme, bullies, and not used. So that's an example. Insight has always had something called the Cloud Data Management Assessment. It is an assessment that is not focused just on the storage, but the workloads, the storage, which ones can go in the cloud. We called it a Cloud Data Management because it was helping us align data management across the different components of the data fabric. And that's one of the reasons that NetApp actually created something called the Joint Investment Program. But what it means to you, the client, is NetApp will pay us to do this because they realize that because of the breadth of their offering, the more you understand how your data fits into these different areas of the data fabric, the better for them because they're the ones who can do it. And so we've been doing a lot of those with NetApp, and it ends up that NetApp will fund those. And then there's another more advanced and probably more strategic. When you're moving workloads from your data center either to the cloud or to another data center, you're introducing another level of risk, which is I'm changing the network. So if I, for example, had a SQL server and I said, oh, well, Microsoft said it's really easy to move the SQL server to the cloud, and you move the SQL server and you forgot about the other 5 applications that use the SQL server for its database, then you will have created a problem because you separated them and you separated their network. And so what a WXA does, and NetApp realized they had this problem with, for example, their SDW, their Service Design Workshop, is they weren't seeing that. And so we actually worked together to put those together that says we can see the interoperability and the essentially the application alignment of all the applications, so that when you're thinking about moving things around, you move them in related units, if you would. So those are all example services that says, now that we're talking, I'd like more information, and these are just different ways to do that. So a couple of quick stories. I gave you some different use cases, and one of the things we like to do is show some of the different use cases in examples of people that have already done it. So in this case, it was a financial organization. They had used NetApp in the past, and then they started, kind of in the beginning of last year, saying we've got a major cloud strategy here. And what that does is it creates risk for anything CapEx. Matter of fact, they kind of came back and said, look, due to our cloud strategy, CapEx doesn't fit our business model anymore. So instead of saying, well, that's unfortunate, we went with them and worked together with NetApp and said, well, how does Keystone fit into your new business model of cloud alignment? And of course, they saw what we saw is this is an awesome bridge to the cloud. In the reality, they had somewhere in the 5,000 workloads, and they had less than 5 in the cloud already. And so we can guess at how fast they're going to move things to the cloud, but they were still moving data centers and consolidating, et cetera. And so this became the de facto platform is let's get it on Keystone and figure out what the next steps are. What was interesting about that, there was another environment that hadn't been NetApp's domain, which was what they called their tier 0 block storage. And, as we got going and they started saying, okay, I'm going to move a data center, there was no solution for the tier 0 block storage. So suddenly, instead of saying, well, NetApp is not my vendor for tier 0 block, it became, well, NetApp's going to be my vendor for Tier 0 block because they've got a solution for me. It's a great solution that sets me up, here, and if it ends up going in the cloud in a year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, I've got that flexibility of choice. And so that's an example there, and it's a financial organization, and really summarizes, we help them align to a cloud strategy, whatever that may be. This is a federal agency. In their case, they had a lot of money and more money coming in. It's the example I gave. But anybody in public sector will probably appreciate the best part of this. So in their case, they were looking at a refresh and saying, gee, we're just uncertain of what's going to happen next year and the year after. And if this happens, we'll grow. If this happens, we're going to, bifurcate a piece off to another organization, et cetera. So we said, well, how does Keystone fit in with your evolving plans? And they looked at that and compared it to, gee, if I had Keystone versus buying it for 4 years, if I used the same amount, Keystone would have been at the time just a little more expensive for their environment. But they almost immediately said, this is perfect. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because we immediately thought, well, they're going to wait for the new budget year and try to get this in the new budget. And instead, they went immediately to RFQ, which is a public competitive RFQ, said this is exactly what we need to find it in such a way that we answered it and were awarded a federal RFQ in 5 weeks. So again, almost unheard of in public sector, but it fit the needs so well. They knew exactly what they needed, and they didn't wait for the next year to figure out how to do it, because it was a perfect alignment. And we're seeing this in federal organizations, in state organizations, and in universities, across the board, that this is a perfect fit, whether it's a cloud strategy, a budgeting strategy, how do I use it strategy, the flexibility and the ability to align to a budgeting model versus you purchase it when, we make you purchase it model is really appealing. I think there's at least 8 I know of RFQs, RFPs, RFIs on the street in the federal space for sure, plus all the states we're talking to and all the universities, but those are, on the street right now, and they're really literally asking for a service and defining as a service and saying, we don't want to own this, we don't want to manage this, et cetera. The last was an example of a refresh. This example really just says, instead of just saying, well, I'm not ready to buy new technology, I have something today because I'm still operating. Maybe it's perfect, maybe it's not. And so what happens once it gets to a certain age is you have to buy new support to keep it going, especially if you're public and have that, fiduciary responsibility. And so in this case, they were saying, what I'd really like to do is take, 3 data centers and move it into 2. And even though I've got a huge cloud strategy that provides uncertainty in how long I want to do this. And so we said, oh, okay, well, we could do for $1.2 million in their example, we can get this into 2 data centers and it'll be awesome, just what you want. And that wasn't really appealing because of the long-term implication of a $1 million purchase in their case. And so they were then looking at, it was going to be about $500,000 of maintenance because of the number of distributed systems they had, which again wasn't a perfect place operationally, but it was starting to get expensive to operate that way. And so, this one was cut and dry. Well, Keystone's $300,000 a year, which is cheaper than your support maintenance and pretty competitive with a buy. So that became kind of a no-brainer. And so one of the things we're doing is saying, look, before just extending the life of existing technology, see if this isn't a better choice. And so that's what we're doing. So there's different ways that people want to operate. Some people hear the word cloud and they hear the word it's a fully managed service. And matter of fact, NetApp might say that about their cloud volumes, et cetera. So we offer that, that if you want to consume this as a cloud where you don't even touch it, you don't do anything, you just press a button and it's provisioned and somebody's taking care of all that behind you. That's what we'll call a fully operated or fully managed. But what we are seeing, even in the public space, in the federal space, we are seeing, probably 90%, maybe 80% of saying, don't change my operational model. unless I have a resource problem, how I'm operating is great. What I want to change first is how I consume. And so there's this concept of I don't need to change your operation in any way, shape, or form to get you onto a consumption model like Keystone. You can still run reports, provision things when you want to, go and touch it, look at it, things like that. Or if you want to start saying, look, I want to focus on some other things and hand over some of the keys, you can do that as well. And at Insight, we basically give you a baseline of we'll do this, which includes level 1, 2 support, or you can build into it. And so this is our managed services model. It aligns to Keystone, but it wasn't built for Keystone. So, you know, when NetApp's like, and we're going to give you some videos where NetApp will talk about the partnership we have with them on Keystone. And they might refer to, wow, Insight is really well aligned. We didn't change our company because of Keystone. We actually worked closely with NetApp and said, hey, this is how the industry is asking for billing. This is how the industry is asking for things. You know, we've been doing Azure and AWS and other as a service for years, and they made adjustments to make it fit. So this model, our managed services model, really is the same model you'd see whether we were talking about AWS, Azure, Keystone, or other things, where there's a base level of essential services for us to deliver a service, and then you can pick off a menu of advanced services or premier services to say, these are things I'd like you to do instead of me. So that's the model that we deliver all of our services, including Keystone, on. And I think the last part would be, you know, I mentioned at the beginning, NetApp they've got an awesome video. You could probably Google it. I think they were calling the mother flippin' data management experts across cloud and hybrid cloud, et cetera. And I think hopefully we illustrated Keystone kind of demonstrates that. But it is data management. And so in many environments, people say, well, what do I do for compute? We have partnerships with all of these organizations. I think you're going to hear very shortly about Cisco's as a service. It's probably out there, but we're part of that, first one in. But, you know, the compute vendors, the networking vendors, the cloud providers, the data protection providers, we have agreements with all of these organizations. And so it doesn't have to be just Keystone, just data. It can be Keystone in a cloud environment backed up by a data protection environment with a security envelope around it. We can help put all of that together. So that's really what Insight is doing with the services. And we'll leave you with one last spot, and hopefully there's a couple of questions. But we're going to send out an ability to get a copy of this presentation. But we actually did some stuff where NetApp, you know, if they were doing their Insight conference, which I think was last November, and they actually did an interview with us. Sunitha Rowe runs the Keystone business at NetApp, and she did an interview with us that's available on their website. So if you go out to NetApp Services Keystone, essentially, you'll see that interview, and that's a great way to hear NetApp ask us questions about Keystone in the market. At that Insight conference, we're obviously a sponsor. You know, we did a presentation and said, hey, Sunitha, why don't you be part of our presentation? And I think we had like 150 people participate in that and follow up. So it was a hot topic. Hopefully you know somebody at Insight to get connected to if you want to follow up and get some more information. If for any reason you don't, we've built an alias. If you wanted to talk to Insight, there's called Insight for Keystone at NetApp.com. Incidentally, if you wanted somebody from NetApp to talk to you first, you could do Insight for Keystone at NetApp.com. And either way, somebody will get back to you. And again, I think one of the big things that we're seeing is as people go through in this changing environment from an operational and a business and a budgeting point of view, you know, there's this concept that a lot of people are thinking about refreshing the new technology, and maybe that works, maybe that doesn't, depending on a lot of different variables. Before saying I want to renew the support of my existing, we are seeing probably 60 plus 70% are saying, hey, this Keystone thing actually might be a really good fit here. So with that, I'm going to see, I think, I'm not sure if these questions came in before. They probably came in before we started. So what we can do is open it up to any questions. And if there's not, Christy, I guess we could probably apologize again for starting late, but then sign off if needed.
Yes, I'm not seeing any questions either, Kent. Like Kent mentioned, though, if you do have questions, please use that alias or reach out to your Insight rep. And again, we do apologize for the delay in the webcast, but we appreciate you joining. An on-demand version of this will be available within 2 to 3 days, and you'll receive an email notification once that recording is available. Thank you again for participating in today's webcast.